Welcome to Rethink Community Podcast, brought to you by Think Tank, Inc. I'm your host, John White. For the last 10 years, Think Tank has been helping people and organizations step into the stories of those who face poverty every day. We believe that stories have the power to break through our opinions and positions and bring us together. On this podcast, we bring you real stories from real people who have grappled with poverty, faced obstacles, blazed new trails, and forged unlikely relationships. Where did you learn how to help others? Did you ever stop to think about where those ideas came from? And have you ever stopped to think about whether those ideas are really working? On today's episode, Think Tank's Executive Director Marlo Fox tells us the stories that launched her to help others think differently about poverty. I have with me Marlo Fox as my guest today in our podcast series, and welcome, Marlo.
Thank you.
Marlo has a career in social services, graduate from Anderson University out of Indiana a long time ago.
Not that long
I'd
ago.
say about 20 years or so. And over time, she has shifted her views on poverty. And you've been working in poverty alleviation for 15, 20 years. You've shifted some of your views.
Right.
You've attacked some of the misconceptions about poverty, American poverty, some of the, I would say, lies out there about the issues about poverty. And you founded Think Tank in 2006, and very successful nonprofit, and I guess you work in 38 states throughout the country.
That's correct.
So tell me, how did you get started with this? What was the spark in your life that got you into this position?
Well, I think it was a number of things. I can think about a particular story that comes to mind just kind of during my formative years. I knew I had a background. My family was in education and small business, and I knew I wanted to dedicate my life to something that was bigger than myself. And there was a mission trip that I had taken going into my senior year of high school, and it was interesting because some of you may remember in the early 90s, Hurricane Andrew, and that hit the Homestead, Florida, so the tip of Florida. And about a year later, they sent a crew of us from my church down to do some hurricane relief, which we have a better understanding of now in Dayton, Ohio, 9 months into post-tornado. And so I went down with that crew, and I encountered a situation where I was set up to be a helper. And there was lots of messages throughout my life about what it meant to be someone in a position to help somebody else. You know, what it meant to be in a position of privilege and help somebody else. And so we found ourselves in a situation where we were going into this Latino community a year later, that had been, lived through this situation. And we said we were going to, we had been told we were going to be part of a rebuilding effort. And we went into this situation, and I remember being in the home of a family that was living in pretty dire poverty. And it was evident that this had been a part of their story way before a hurricane had hit. And here we were, a group of white teenagers from, southern Ohio that had come down to help. And they gave us all a bunch of buckets of paint, and we started to paint this house. Now, picture this house. It's a block house, very small. Most of the windows were blown out, cement floor. And here we are painting this house. And I remember encountering the family, and there was a language barrier there, and I looked the mom in the eye, the matriarch of the house, and we were kind of avoiding each other in the home. And I realized, just this question came over me, what are we doing here? Because we were totally robbing her of her dignity. She didn't need for us to come down to Florida to paint her house. I mean, that was not the issue. There were plenty of able-bodied people around there. The issue was that we needed to feel like we were helping. And so kind of early on, I realized I wanted to go into the helping fields, but I knew that there was something kind of terribly wrong about how we had thought about helping. And so I got the privilege to work in my own community. I got the privilege to walk alongside people that were coming off public assistance and moving into the world of work. And I saw that that was not my isolated incident that I'd experienced on a mission trip, but we had this whole system that was set up to help people, but was not listening to people, not partnering with people, and really not coming alongside people in ways that were transformative. And so, just a bunch of small stories over the course of many years really led us to this point.
Yeah, how long is this system? What you're saying, you're calling out this system in America, this helping system. That this is the ladder is leaning on the wrong wall. Is what you're saying,
right?
Tell us about that.
Yeah.
What are some lies that things that we're doing right now that we're not even aware of that we're actually hurting as opposed to helping people?
Well, I think there are a number of things, but at the core of it, and I think we all feel this in our society, there's just a sense of us and them. And that comes from a place where a lot of well-intentioned people and a lot of well-intentioned efforts have been made to bring a particular remedy to an issue that we see, but we don't always bring it with humanity. And oftentimes what's happened is I think that we've put a lot of pressure on our helpers to be the expert, to come in with solutions, to have all the resources necessary to fix a very complex situation that has way more, involved than what may be presenting itself in the moment. And so, I think that one of the things that we really try to educate people on at Think Tank is that we have this operating system. And so I like to use the metaphor of a computer. And so we've got this operating system. So I'm a PC user. And it kind of just runs in the background. And every now and then we'll get a pop-up and on our screen, and it'll say, hey, you need to update your system. But typically we don't think about it. And so we are involved, all of us that are trying to do something to alleviate poverty in one way. We've been told what it means to help somebody else. And oftentimes what we've been told is you need to have the solution. You need to be the expert. You're the only one that can bring resources to the table. It's kind of this one-way flow from giver to receiver. And so what we're trying to turn the tide on is we're trying to say, no, that's number one, that's not honoring to people that have so much to bring to the table. And need to be the ones that are central to the solution. And frankly, it just doesn't work. And so that's really what we've been about, is rather than totally just condemn what we've inherited in this helping system that creates experts, and winners and losers, rather than just condemn that, we've said, okay, we can paint an alternate reality. We can show another way. And so that's what Think Tank's been about the last 13 years now.
But you're saying that helping can be very gratifying. If I've got some resources, I want to go in, and I think I've earned the right to go in because I've learned something about my life and my situation. And you're saying that's kind of hold the phone. Just resist that temptation to come in and save someone. That's what you're saying.
Yes, I think that one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that absolutely in those situations, you do have something to bring to the table. We all have something to bring to the table. And that's really the beauty. And so, we talk about lived experience. We all bring lived experience to the table, right? And so, but what we got to remember is that everybody's lived experience is equally valuable. And those that are really there experiencing the struggle, they're really the ones that are closest, to the solution. And so it's really about coming alongside. And so that's one of our principles, is doing with versus to or for.
Right. I've read so many, the last 10 years, there's been this big movement of big philanthropists who have this wonderful idea, and they want to go bring this big idea to a hurting region of an African country or something like this, and they pour all these resources into this solution, and yet they walk away 3 years later. It's in worse condition than it was, and And we've seen that in spades
Right.
in our country.
Right.
Great big hearts, lots of resources, lots of might, and we know a solution. Let's just go bring it to that people group, if you will, and we'll then walk away and everything will be better. You're saying that there's a foundational issue there.
Right.
And a heart issue.
Right.
And an approach issue. And you're saying, well, we need to listen first. One of your operating principles, listening first. That seems so obvious, but it's not. Why?
Well, I can speak to my own life. Again, I think it's twofold. One, I think it's a human condition, is that it's really difficult to listen. It requires discipline. It takes longer. It requires letting down your ego and recognizing you don't have the full answer. And so just the human condition works against listening. And I also think that in our systems there again, many of us are paid to be the expert, and so we're meant to, be the ones that are propped up to bring in the solution, and that gives us value. And so I think part of that is, and you've seen this, you mentioned philanthropic work. We're starting to see a different kind of model rewarded, right? We're starting to see investment that's much more collaborative, investment that puts people experiencing poverty at the center of the solution, and different philanthropy models that trends that we're starting to see. And so I think that's a really hopeful thing.
Yes, and your other operating systems, listening first is certainly a very important one. Pursue holistic solutions. That's a big one. Can you give me a soundbite or two around what that really means, and then we'll work through the other operating systems?
Sure. And I think this is pretty intuitive to people, but I mentioned when I first started my career, I was working with people that were getting back into the workforce, right? And so we know a job is pretty critical to economic stability, is having that sense of purpose and paycheck and all of that. And so, but what I think all of us know intuitively, and I knew in a really raw way when I started working in that field, is that if I was only going to be looking at job skills, right, and soft skills and getting somebody connected to a position, then I was not going to be able to effectively help anybody. Is that, there's a whole number of things that make up a person's experience. And so if I neglected the fact that there were family commitments there and lack of childcare, if I neglected the fact that there were transportation issues, or just the emotional ability to deal with conflict, then I was not going to be able to holistically appreciate a person and what their needs were and what they brought to the table. And so I think that applies very personally in that example that I just gave, and I think it applies across a community.
Sure, and so that's the holistic solution of you can fix this, but if you don't have
if you
this
neglect
covered,
the other components, sure.
And social service in America seems to have kind of they silo some of these things.
Right.
They silo some of these things, and I think there is a greater movement of recognizing that those things all of them have to be cared for: spirit, mind, body, emotional, financial, and that. So that's that. There's a trend especially in our academic institutions to say, wait a second, let's look at this holistic. So that's a very excellent principle. And of course, then working with, instead of doing to or for, working with those that are affected, as opposed to doing to or for them.
Right.
How does that work?
Well, I think I described earlier, my early formative encounter when we went on a missions trip, and that was very a do to. So what if we had played that out differently? What if we actually said, hey, do you really need us to come anyway? Or if you do, what would be the most helpful thing that a group of teenagers could do over the course of a week that they were, here on site, helping you with hurricane relief? And so fundamentally working with is coming alongside without your agenda.
Oh. Coming
alongside, open to take a step back if you're not needed. Just kind of rejecting that tendency, like you mentioned it earlier, John, to want to save, that God complex that we bring in sometimes, saying, I'm the one, I want to be a hero. That feels good. We all, we've been parents, we've been, anytime when somebody's hurting and we can come in and save, that feels good. And there's an element of that that's okay. So just knowing those instincts are in our nature to do 2 or 4, and really kind of work in the process to say, no, we want to walk alongside, and what is it you really need now?
Yeah. It's the ego check in so many cases. We're resisting the ego check to go in, and even with our good intentions. And I think there's a book out that sold millions called Toxic Charity. Toxic Charity. Now that's a big word or a big phrase about toxic. What does toxic charity mean to you?
Well, it goes back to the thought that any charity that's just one way isn't true charity. Fundamentally, we need to realize that we all need one another. And I learned really early on when I started working with families in this very community that I thought I'd come to help and I was being helped. And so that's just the reality, that if we set up exchanges that are just one way, then right from the very beginning, we've created toxicity.
Another operating principle is obviously promoting leadership from within. Of course, people would read that and say, of course, we want to build leadership from within. But actually, when I drive down, when I'm in the community, sometimes my instincts, when I see an individual or a neighborhood or community, is I don't see any leadership there. I see a deficit. And therefore, if I see a deficit, I want to help certainly fix that deficit, as opposed to seeing an asset, seeing strengths and gifts. That really is, for those of us in the helping field that want to remedy some of the injustices in our communities, that's hard to resist or hard to switch off that paradigm of seeing an asset and gifts as opposed to deficits. Is that right?
Well, I think we need to have new eyes to see. And one thing I think that could be very helpful is starting to look for where people are taking initiative. In every community, people are taking initiative and they're doing something. And it could be as small as doing a cleanup to something like, starting a business, a very small business. So I'm thinking of someone I know in a community nearby here that started a diner. And when she tells her story, because her background had been, she had no financial capital. She was caught up in addiction for a number of years. She didn't know anybody that had run a business, but she knew how to cook. And so when she tells her story, she talks about there's a gentleman that had, just a building that had been a kitchen at one time, and he saw potential in me. Because he saw me taking initiative. He was my neighbor, and he saw me taking initiative with my kids, and he saw me taking initiative with the neighborhood kids, and he saw me and my passion for cooking. And so he was able to create a pathway for me where he basically sponsored me for a period of time until I had enough capital to get this business kickstarted. And so I think a lot of it is, do we look for initiative and trust people and invest in people? Particularly when we've just been trained to see deficit.
It's like we have children. Do you see deficits in your children, or do you have a tendency to see their gifts and want to elevate their gifts and help them discover their gifts and refine their gifts? And if we only would see our communities the way we see our children, perhaps we would be. We could get over the hump.
So one of the things, John, is that this doesn't happen by drive-by or drive-through. You mentioned right. I drive through a neighborhood. Well, that's
sure.
not your neighborhood. And so part of it is, are we willing to get proximate and to really invest? And, there are leaders on every block in every neighborhood that are already leading in amazing ways. And so are we willing to develop relationships? And, this is another principle that's not written down here, but it's something that Think Tank really promotes, which is, and I'm proud to see people like Michelle Warren writing about this. She wrote a book called Proximity. Brian Stevenson and his recent film, and if you've heard any interviews with him, Just Mercy, he talks a lot about this, that he said, if I was ever going to be effective as an attorney, if I was ever going to be effective, I'm going to use a word as a helper. then I had to get proximate, and I had to understand people's worlds, and I had to come alongside. He's saying the same thing we're saying here.
Right.
And so, part of it is it takes a long time. It takes presence, and it's not just drive-by stuff. And so really it's our willingness to really invest and see where initiatives already taken place.
Getting proximate, getting closer.
Yeah.
And that means in some cases having friendships with those that we normally, or in some cases wouldn't normally hang out with. And you're saying that's one of the building blocks of some of your foundations is I got to get out of my cul-de-sac.
Yeah.
And discover something about my community, about myself, more importantly, that gosh, do I have blinders on? And once we get beyond that, and it becomes almost a lifestyle for us, and a joyful lifestyle, because you're in the process of discovering, and your world becomes so much bigger. That's hard to do, though.
Yeah, it's interesting. So when I was a young social worker, here's what I was told: don't give people your cell phone number. Create boundaries. Basically, you're here 9 to 5, and you don't need to be having contact with anybody that you're working with outside of that. Now, some of that stuff's in place for good reason, but again, I think that is just one example of what we find in society where there haven't been enough meaningful places for people to connect authentically across areas of difference. Certainly, we see this across socioeconomic lines, across racial lines, and so. One of the things that we did was we said, okay, where are those places where we have a natural opportunity to connect? And where there aren't those places, where could we create that space in our community? And so some of the things that Think Tank's really been a part of, the Circles initiative, and really bringing people together to, build bonds across race and class lines. Even the COPE experience. I mean, the COPE is really about if you're so isolated that you don't have somebody in your life that's living and facing and just doing some amazing things to overcome poverty. If you don't have access to that, then we're going to give you a vicarious experience. We're going to create an experience where you can walk in someone's shoes. And hopefully that will create an appetite where you say, like you said, John, wow, I need to be around people in my life that are just overcoming some immense odds, because not only may I be able to offer some help, but my life's going to be enriched by doing that.
Well, Marlo Fox, thanks for being here. This is a fascinating discussion, and one that we could spend a great amount of time on. And because next time I think I'd like to have you on to talk about some examples that we've discovered in our community, and some ways that we can all personally get out of our box and to experience the joy of being in community, real community. Thank you. This has been the Rethink Community Podcast, brought to you by Think Tank, Inc., with music by Elijah Hamilton. Don't forget to subscribe to hear upcoming episodes featuring the stories of other courageous individuals we think you should know. And if you are part of an organization that would like to be better equipped to serve people in poverty, be sure to check out the resources we offer, including the Cost of Poverty Experience, or COPE, at thinktank-inc.org/COPE. Join the hundreds of businesses, schools, colleges, churches, and healthcare providers that have used the Cost of Poverty Experience, along with our other suite of tools and coaching to find new ways of thinking and responding to poverty.